It's May 11th, 2026. Welcome to YesToHellWith.com. Today we discuss something most Americans never stop to consider. What exactly is the FBI supposed to do before a federal prosecution begins? Most people assume the answer is obvious. The investigators verify, they authenticate, they challenge assumptions. They independently establish the factual foundation of the case. And perhaps most important of all, people assume the FBI does not simply accept the narrative of a bank or an institution without independently confirming that accusation. But according to Carter's materials and the records we have from the federal government, that is precisely the concern. The allegation is not merely that the FBI reached the wrong conclusion. The allegation is that the FBI never verified the underlying structure of the case before the prosecution moved forward. Now think carefully about what this means. The government's theory depended upon a $4 million obligation. So naturally the next question becomes, did the FBI obtain the authenticated loan records? Then there's the other question, did the FBI independently verify the obligation? Or did the FBI conduct forensic accounting? Did the FBI contact the OCC? Did the FBI independently confirm that the debt legally existed? Did the FBI distinguish between a lease structure and a loan structure? Did the FBI examine whether corporate resolutions lawfully authorized the obligation? Did the FBI ascertain the laws and regulations for the state of Ohio? These questions were never actually entered. And this matters enormously because once investigators accept an assumption, that assumption begins hardening into investigative reality. Then prosecutors inherit those very assumptions. Then the courtroom inherits those very presumptions. So we see how it goes, because eventually the jury inherits those very assumptions. And eventually presumptions become the record, the court record. This is exactly what we discussed in the earlier series, the collapse of the burden of proof. Because in many prosecutions, the public presumes the burden was already satisfied before trial ever begins. And what if the burden itself was never independently established? Now, according to later filings and OCC materials, including admissions by PNC Bank, that there was no $4 million loan, major contradictions emerged. But by then the case had already moved through investigation, indictment, trial, and conviction. And that reveals something important. The moment presumptions become institutionalized, the system begins defending the presumptions themselves. That is why the investigation stage matters so much. Because once the structure moves forward, reversing it becomes difficult and impossible. Now let's understand something else. Most Americans believe investigators are gathering facts in a neutral environment. But investigations are shaped by pressure, timing, institutional expectations, and narrative formation. Once a bank identifies itself as the victim, and once investigators begin operating from the presumption that the financial obligation exists, and every subsequent step begins moving downstream from that presumption, well, this is where the Liberty Dialogues framework becomes extremely important. Because under the Liberty Dialogues analysis, the proper sequence requires authority, jurisdiction, status, standing, obligation before enforcement. But in this case, the obligation itself was never independently authenticated in the manner that the public expects. Now think carefully about what happens if that sequence reverses authority, jurisdiction, status, standing, and obligation. If investigators begin from the presumption that the obligation exists, then every later question becomes distorted by that premise. The issue quietly shifts from, did the obligation actually exist, to, did the defendant conceal the obligation? That distinction changes everything, because once the first question disappears, the second question begins operating as though the structure beneath was already proven. This is exactly what occurred. Now, this is why the FBI investigation matters so much years later, and even now. Later contradictions raise questions not merely about the prosecution, but about whether the investigation itself independently verified the foundational structure before the criminal case was ever built. And once the prosecution moved forward, those presumptions became harder and harder to challenge. At what point were the investigators willing to slow the process down and independently verify the structure before lives were destroyed? Where were the prosecutors willing to revisit assumptions when contradictions emerged? Where were the institutions willing to admit that a foundational premise was never properly established? Because if the investigative foundation was flawed from the beginning, then every later stage inherits that flaw. And once institutional momentum takes hold, truth itself becomes secondary to preserving the structure already built based upon that presumption. In the next episode, when a bank becomes the victim, and we begin examining how institutional credibility and banking prestige shapes federal prosecutions long before jurors ever enter the courtroom. And as always, may truth reign supreme.